Join me in welcoming Roberto Bellini, the CEO of Bellus Health.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for the conference organizers for having me today. So I'm going to be taking you through the corporate presentation today, and what we'll do is we'll definitely leave some time at the end of the presentation for some Q&A. Before we get started, this is our forward-looking statement slide. I'm sure you've seen many of these today, and I do encourage you before making any investment decisions to review our annual information form. So Bellus is a publicly listed company based out in Montreal. It's listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange. Our core program is BLU-5937 for chronic cough. This is an exciting area. This is a P2X3 antagonist. It's a large population targeted by big pharma, clear validated mechanism where we really feel that we have best-in-class potential, and I think that we already have data to showcase that, and I'll be taking you through that today. On top of that, very clear plan in terms of creating value for our story. We have great investors involved with the story, strong balance sheet, very nice platform to build even beyond cough. I'll be talking to you about that today. Very good management team that's involved in the story, lots of experience. I've been doing this for almost 20 years now. My background is from a family office that invests almost exclusively in the healthcare space. Dr. Denis Garceau has done multiple phase 2, phase 3 studies, global programs, a lot of experience on the team. The board of directors has a lot of experience as well. Cho Kwong, maybe I can highlight a couple of them. Cho Kwong is from OrbiMed. He just joined the board. He was a lead investor in our last financing. Franklin Berger, top-ranked biotech analyst from JP Morgan previously, now sits on board as a private investor. So a lot of really, really good people supporting the company. So let's talk about chronic cough. Chronic cough is defined as a cough that lasts for longer than 8 weeks. When you use that definition, there's about 10% of the adult population in the U.S. and all developed countries that have cough. So that's about 26 million patients in the U.S. When you think about those patients, the cause of the cough or the underlying condition of the cough is very important. It can be due to allergies, acid reflux, and when you think about that, and when you treat that underlying cause of the cough, what it does is the cough will go away. But there are a number of patients that have refractory chronic cough. That refractory chronic cough, that's about 10% of the people with cough. So about 2.6 million patients in the U.S. For those patients, those are the ones that suffer a lot. They cough a lot. They cough 20, 30, 40 times an hour. They have physical pain from coughing. They also have psychosocial difficulties with this cough. So they have difficulties where they have difficulties going to dates, difficulties just in terms of like just interacting with people. So like when they go to the theater, those kinds of things. And that's really where you have a high quality of life issue with cough. When you think about targeting chronic cough, the P2X3 receptor is a very important target here. So this is a sensory receptor. It's found throughout the body, but in the upper airway, it acts to feel irritation and sends a signaling message up to the brain to give you that urge to cough reflex, causing you to cough. So it definitely makes a lot of sense in terms of targeting this receptor with a small molecule antagonist to stop people from coughing. And we know that works. So Merck has a drug in development right now. It's in phase 3. It's a potent P2X3 antagonist. It works extremely well. It reduces awake cough frequency in patients by up to 86%. The problem is not the efficacy. The problem is the tolerability profile. So 80% of patients that take this drug at the therapeutic dose have tolerability issues with their taste effects. So this means that they have taste alteration, partial or even complete taste loss. And as you can imagine, cough is a quality of life issue. Taste is a very important part of your quality of life. So in this indication in particular, having this kind of side effect will be important in terms of compliance and tolerability. So why does Merck have that taste issue, it's really because P2X3, there are essentially two forms of this receptor in the body. There's the P2X3 receptor. These are essentially trimers. The P2X3 receptor are 3 subunits of P2X3. That receptor is heavily found in the upper airway. It's the one that's primarily triggering the cough reflex. There's another form of this receptor called P2X23. I often like to call it kind of like a cousin receptor. It's the same sensory receptor, plays a similar kind of role, really depending on its localization. This one's heavily found in the taste buds. The Merck drug doesn't differentiate between these two receptors, or differentiates very slightly in terms of their selectivity, which means that at the effective dose in terms of reducing cough, it's also having an important impact on taste. What that does create is essentially the project hypothesis for our drug is to generate a small molecule that can solely inhibit the P2X3 receptor while being also very selective and not inhibiting the P2X23 receptor at therapeutic doses. And that's what we have with 5937. So 5937 is highly potent at the P2X3 receptor. It's more potent than the Merck drug, not by a lot, but by about threefold. But even more importantly, in terms of differentiation, it's highly selective for P2X3 versus P2X2/3. So when we think about the different kind of selectivity, the Merck drug is about 2 to 7-fold selective. As they've reported, our selectivity is over 1,500-fold selectivity. What that translates into, so on the P2X3 side, we're talking about equivalent efficacy in terms of reducing cough. We haven't shown that in patients yet. That's our next step in terms of our development path. But we have shown it already in animals, and I'll show you some data on that in a little bit. But really, in terms of the selectivity and in terms of the differentiation there, that's where we've already shown key differentiation versus Merck, and we've shown little to no impact on taste in subjects in our phase 1 study. And I'll also show you that data, and it's on the next slide. So I think this is really our key data. This is the key data that drove our last financing as well. We reported this data in November. In this table, as you can see, we're comparing the Merck optimal dose at 50 milligrams. At this dose, they had about 80% of patients have adverse taste events. And these are characterized in 3 different ways. So you have taste alteration. That's often characterized for patients as a metallic taste in the mouth, gumminess taste in the mouth. It's persistent. Then we have partial taste loss. Partial taste loss is characterized by patients as lacking flavor. So you'll see a lot of patients that this happens, they'll try to add salt to their food. Obviously, adding salt doesn't help, but it also doesn't allow them to really enjoy their food. Worst out of the 3 is complete taste loss. I mean, this is something that we can all appreciate. You just completely are unable to taste your food. And if you compare that, obviously, to our data, and here we're comparing at doses where we feel that we could drive similar inhibition levels of P2X3, so where we would get similar kind of efficacy in cough patients, we have no complete taste loss, no partial taste loss, and very little mild taste alteration. For sure, our study here is in a small sample size, so it's not a very large data set. It's also in single dose and 7-day dosing. We think that that's comparable here. When you see this side effect, you see it right away on first dose. So I think that these are relatively comparable data sets, though, as I said, it's a small sample size, and these numbers may shift a bit. Like we may end up with, 7, 8, 10% taste alteration, maybe, 1 partial taste alteration. But altogether, you can clearly see that there's huge differentiation between the side effects that Merck has and what we've seen in our study to date. On the efficacy side, these are really the 3 key pieces of data to support us having similar levels of efficacy to Merck. In the center panel is an expression analysis looking at the expression of P2X2 and P2X3 in the upper airway of the guinea pig. In the upper airway, you have almost exclusive expression of P2X3. That's the driving force for providing the signaling to cough to the brain. On the left side panel, this is an animal study where we've gone head-to-head versus Merck. This is a guinea pig model, cough model, where you nebulize citric acid and histamine, causes the guinea pigs to cough, and then you measure their coughs over a 15-minute period. As you can see, in a dose-dependent fashion, as we're increasing doses, you see the exact same levels of efficacy between, or reduction in cough for both of the products, both the Merck product as well as our product. So clearly in the animal we're having the same efficacy. You ask, what about the human? Obviously we'll go into phase 2 to prove that, but I think that there is very supportive data even from Merck in terms of showing that P2X3 is the main driver for cough. So if you look on the right-hand side panel, here this is a dose range finding study that Afferent actually did. Merck acquired this program from a company called Afferent in 2016. They did this data. This is actually the data that caused Merck to acquire that company for $1.25 billion, $500 million upfront. So as you can see here, the cough count are in the red bars. The taste effect, percentage of patients having taste effect is in the gray line. Max efficacy is in the 30 to 50 milligram dose. At those doses, you have full inhibition of the P2X3 receptor. You have partial inhibition of the P2X2/3 receptor. If P2X2/3 was important in driving efficacy, as you would go up in dosing, you would see more efficacy. You don't see that. What you see is more taste effects. So again, the clinical data from Merck itself here is very validating to support that P2X3 is the driver for cough and P2X23 is the driver for taste. We look at the competitive landscape. We've talked about Merck a lot. Merck has taken, post their acquisition of Afferent, are now in phase 3 with 2 doses, 45 milligram dose and a 15 milligram dose. The high dose will have high efficacy, but will have a high tolerability issue with the taste effect. That's the data that you saw previously with 80% of patients having a taste effect. The low dose will have a relatively clean safety profile with relatively no taste effects. Unfortunately, that dose also has very limited in terms of efficacy and hasn't shown a statistically significant level of efficacy in previous studies. So obviously there isn't a perfect product profile here for Merck, which is generating the real opportunity to deliver a second generation compound. We're obviously also not the only ones to believe that. We do have competition from Bayer and Shionogi. Really where we differentiate from those programs is in selectivity. So the selectivity of the Bayer and Shionogi program based on our estimates and what they've released to date, we don't know exactly the specific molecules. So these are based on publications that they've done on a representative compound, and in the case of Bayer, based on their patent filings. But we expect their selectivity to be in the 100-fold range. We're 1,500-fold range. So we do think that Bayer and Shionogi will do better than Merck. Merck is at 80% in terms of taste effects. But we think that we'll be best in class, being at 5% and really positioned here as the leader for P2X3. So we'll dive into a little bit more detail on the phase 1 study. This study was reported on in November of last year. So the classic single ascending dose and multiple ascending dose combined study. 60 healthy subjects on the single ascending dose, where we've gone from 50 milligrams all the way up to 1,200 milligrams, and 30 subjects in the multiple ascending dose, where we've done 100, 200, and 400 milligrams BID for 7 days. If we look at PK profile and expected dosing, PK profile is great. It's rapidly absorbed, Tmax at about 1 hour, which is very nice in an acute indication like cough. It gives you that immediate relief when you take the drug. Very nice systemic exposure up to 800 milligrams. Half-life that supports BID dosing, which is the same dosing that Merck has in their phase 3 study. No food effect. No accumulation of drug, so very nice profile overall. When we look at what we expect to be the therapeutic dose going forward, so here we're looking at our animal models and reaching a full inhibition of the P2X3 receptor. That's going to be hit at about 50 milligrams BID. So we're taking a little bit of a buffer here. 50 to 100 milligrams BID is what we're projecting to be the therapeutic dose. Safe and well tolerated. No serious adverse events in the study. No clinically significant effect on vital signs. Clean safety profile. Side effects at the 50 and 100 milligram dose. Nothing, the usual kind of stuff for a phase 1 study. Some headaches, heartburn. Let's dive into a little bit more detail on the taste effect. I think that's the most important kind of side effect that's been seen, not only for us, but even as a class generally. So that's on the next slide. As you can see here in the table, at the 50 to 100 milligram dose, only one subject had mild taste alteration, so overall less than 5% when you think about these two doses together. As you go up in dosing, you do start getting some slight inhibition of P2X2/3, and that's why you're starting to get some taste alteration at 400 milligrams and above. I think that that's also a positive thing. I think it really shows target engagement and that this drug is having a pharmacological effect. On the market side, as I mentioned earlier, about 10% of the adult population in developed countries have chronic cough. So that includes U.S., EU top 5, Japan. In the U.S., these are numbers for the U.S. That's about 26 million chronic cough patients. Most of those are relatively well addressed. So if you treat that underlying condition, the cough will go away. But there are 2.6 million that have refractory or idiopathic chronic cough. So if the physician treats them for that underlying cause, but the cough continues, or they just don't know what that underlying cause of the disease is, and obviously the cough continues for those as well. That's 2.6 million patients in the U.S. as the primary addressable patient population. You extrapolate that out to Europe, Japan, that's over 6 million patients. So obviously a very, very large market, underserved. There are no specific therapies approved for those refractory chronic cough patients. The only thing that you could take is the last approved drug was actually dextromethorphan, which is the active ingredient in a lot of the anti-cough medication that you find at the pharmacies that really doesn't work well. That was approved over 60 years ago. So definitely high unmet need. If we flip over to pricing, so this is all work done by a market research firm. When we look at comparables, I personally like Linzess. I think Linzess is a great comparable. This is a drug for chronic idiopathic constipation, so another big market indication, lots of people suffering from it, quality of life issue, also cheap alternative drugs available at the pharmacy that don't work well. That drug is priced at $375 per month. It's below the specialty tier, very well covered and reimbursed. That drug sells for $1.5 billion in the U.S. So good comp. If you start putting that kind of pricing together, $300-400 per month, 2.6 million patients, it doesn't even take substantive kind of penetration levels to get to a very sizable multi-billion-dollar potential market just in the U.S. So in terms of next steps, we're now getting ready to move into the phase 2 study. Just recently, we just announced that we've cleared our IND with FDA. We had very little comments from FDA. It was a very, very clean process in terms of getting the IND cleared by them. The phase 2 study is expected to start in mid-2019. I get the question all the time, what does mid-2019 mean? For us, it means first patient, first visit in June, July of this year. So we're excited to get our drug into chronic cough patients very, very shortly. And we expect that study to take about 12 months in total to run all the way to top-line data. So top-line data in mid-2020. In terms of the phase 2 study design, we're not reinventing the wheel here. A number of companies have run chronic cough studies with P2X3 agents. So Afferent, the company that ran studies before they were acquired by Merck, this is really built off of their design. It's a crossover design study where each patient receives 4 doses of the drug at 4-day intervals. You measure their cough using a cough recorder. So it's a little audio recorder that you carry around for 24 hours. It literally records everything that happens around you. It's sent into a central lab, and someone listens into that and counts the number of coughs from the recording. So that's done at baseline, and then it's done at every dose level every 4 days. Once you're done through the 4 dose levels, there's a washout period, your cough goes back up to baseline, and then you're crossed over. People that were on drug go on to placebo, and people that were on placebo go on to drug. Like I said, this is exactly the same study design that was done by Afferent. It's now being used by Bayer and Shionogi as well, so it has been tested. The previous studies from Afferent ran p-values of below 0.01, so they're very, very robust studies. In terms of bridging out beyond just cough, these are receptors or sensory receptors. They're found throughout the body. We believe that they're involved in a number of potentially interesting indications. We're also not the only ones to believe that. So Merck is exploring this in other indications beyond just cough. They started a phase 2 study in pain related to endometriosis. That study will read out in the second half of this year. We've also started internally working on some animal models on an undisclosed indication, and based on our confidence level, I think that we could be in a position in the second half of the year to announce a second indication. In terms of IP, IP is broad, comprehensive, it's composition of matter, it's long dated, it's granted already in all the major markets, including US, Europe, Japan, and China. I think I mentioned it a couple of times already, but post the data in November, we completed a financing in mid-December of last year. It's a $35 million financing. I think it was a very successful financing. We brought in very high quality investors to support the company. The financing was led by OrbiMed. I think another important validating investor in this group is New Leaf Ventures. New Leaf was one of the original founding investors of Afferent, so they know the cough space and the P2X3 space very well. And we've rounded out the financing with groups like First Manhattan, Samsara, ATP, AMZAC, so a really great group of high quality investors. In terms of ownership, the company's about 40% U.S. healthcare institutional ownership, and 25% is owned by the founding family offices. Cap structure is clean. The only difference between basic and fully diluted number of shares outstanding is the stock option plan. There are no debts in the company. There are no convertible securities. So clean cap structure. Company's relatively well financed. These studies are not expensive to run at the beginning. The phase 2 study is expected to cost about $7 to $8 million. We have $36 million US as of the end of last year, which provides us about a 2-year cash runway. In terms of milestones, obviously the data readout in mid-2020 is a very important and large catalyst for the company. That's not so far out from where we are currently. It's about 15 months from now. But even when I think just over the next 12 months, there are operational catalysts as well as external catalysts that can drive value in the company. We will be starting the phase 2 study mid-year, like I mentioned. We will be presenting our phase 1 data at multiple medical conferences. We've already been accepted for a late-breaking abstract at the American Thoracic Society conference, which will be taking place in Dallas at the end of May, and we will also be presenting an abstract at the American Cough Conference, a very specialized cough conference happening in Reston, Virginia, at the beginning of June. Beyond our own, our own internal milestones, external catalysts from our competitors are also important here. So, Merck data from their phase 2 study in endometriosis in the second half of the year can really drive value, build out the market potential further for P2X3 antagonists, as well as our closest competitor in the second generation P2X3 antagonist. So data from Bayer in their phase 1 or phase 2, their phase 2 study is expected to complete in Q3. So we could see data from them by end of year, maybe early 2020. So this is definitely an exciting time for the company. It's an exciting year coming up, and at this point, presentation's done. So I'm happy to kind of take questions from the crowd if we have any. Thanks.
Couple of questions. How did you do the phase 1 before the IND?
That's a really good question. So we didn't do the phase 1. So the question for the people on listening on the webcast is how we could do the phase 1 without having an open IND. The phase 1 wasn't done in the U.S. So the phase 1, we're a Canadian company based out of Montreal, and the phase 1 was done in Canada. Yeah. So we had an open CTA.
And as a curiosity question, how do you measure taste?
So the question is, how do we measure taste? It's actually patient reported. So there's no specific measure. It's really how you experience that as a patient. So all of the adverse events in a phase 1 study are patient reported. And while we could have put in very specific measures to look at taste, I think it was important to kind of generate data that's comparable to the Merck data. And Merck had done it, being patient reported. So you really don't want to be comparing kind of like apples and oranges. So that's how we've done it. But maybe I could add in a little wrinkle there. For someone that does experience some kind of taste effect, we give them a questionnaire. And this is something that Merck did as well. We asked them how bothersome that kind of like taste effect was. And what we've seen, so what Merck has reported in their study is that 40% of patients say that their taste effect is very or extremely bothersome. So on a scale from 1 to 5 is 4 or 5. So it's obviously a lot of people that find it very cumbersome.
Well, I'll ask one more question.
Yeah, go for it.
So the question is, for endometriosis, if your drug is very specific for one receptor and Merck is 2 or 3, do you believe that you're going to be as effective against pain there as they will be?
So that's a really important and great question. We're not 100% certain. What we've started doing is we've started running some animal studies on our side, again, to compare head-to-head and to look at whether we can drive a similar level of efficacy to Merck in an indication like endometriosis. And that, I think, would give further comfort that we could also be effective in that indication. Merck's actually developing or just started a phase 2 study in another indication that wasn't up on the slide. It's in sleep apnea. And we're pretty convinced that in sleep apnea, that's driven by P2X2/3, so the other receptor. So that would not be a good indication for us. Can't win them all.
Thanks.
Do you have plans to come down to the U.S.?
So for sure, our investor base currently is about 40% U.S. institutional investors. And those investors, I think, would love to see us listed on the NASDAQ. So we're building out right now. We're exploring a plan to come and uplist or cross-list on the NASDAQ exchange as well. I think for a company like ours, ability to finance is important. And you do that best being on an exchange like the NASDAQ. Any other questions?
And a quick question.
One other question, go.
The Shionogi and the Bayer data on taste, has that been published or presented at a conference?
So the question is whether there's any competitive data, just repeating for the webcast, is there any competitive data on taste and efficacy for Shionogi and Bayer?
Yeah.
So there isn't. So they haven't reported any of their data yet. They haven't presented any of their data publicly, both in phase 1 or phase 2. So they've obviously completed phase 1 studies here, so they probably have some kind of data around taste, but they have not presented or reported any of that data publicly. Yeah.
Is there any differences in terms of the inclusion criteria? I know you mentioned the designs were very similar, but in terms of inclusion criteria, types of patients in those studies versus your phase 1?
I'd say that they're extremely comparable.
Okay.
Yeah, in terms of their inclusion-exclusion criteria. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.